start. I was pulling up the chat in case anything comes in there. Okay. Well, welcome, friends. My name is Sam Heath, and I'm the Evangelical Network Manager at Equal Justice USA. So we are a criminal justice reform organization that also does racial equity work, and all of that is tied together. We work to repeal the death penalty, talk about trauma-informed policing, racial equity, community healing, all sorts of things that relate to justice not being punishment, but justice being safety, healing, and accountability that repairs. We started a webinar series, and we've called it In the Movement, meaning in the justice movement. And so today we are going to talk with my friend, Lynden Harris. We'll talk for about 45 minutes or so, and we'll save some time at the end for any of you all to put in questions. At the bottom, you'll see, I believe, a Q&A question feature that you can click on, and you can type in and send anything in at any point, and then we'll come to those at the end and leave some space for all of that. But let's go ahead and begin. Lynden, it is great to see you. We've yet to meet in real life in person, but we've engaged each other a lot. So you and I met because you sent me your book right here, right now, Life Stories from America's Death Row, when I came on into this work, and I read it, was struck by it, was haunted by it, reached out to you, and we talked, and we found out very quickly that you and I are kindred spirits because of storytelling in particular. So can you talk about that and stories and how those are especially important to you? Let's start there.
Sure. Well, Hidden Voices came about because I wanted to find a pathway to share the stories that people wanted to tell. And a lot of times people have said to us, well, how do you get people to talk, And in my experience, people are very eager and willing to talk. Their response is just that no one's ever asked. So Hidden Voices works, in diverse communities that have been underrepresented or marginalized to help them share their stories through public forums. So it's been a beautiful, beautiful journey of 20 years sharing stories.
So talk about why storytelling is the theme that Hidden Voices looks at. We'll say what Hidden Voices is in a second, but I really wanted you to touch on that is the theme that connects all these groups that you work with. Why of all themes, that idea of story?
Yeah, well, story is how human beings make sense, right? That's how we understand the way the world works. We make stories, and that's how we communicate to each other, is through the architecture of story. And so it's, so often policy gets made without an understanding of reality on the ground. And the way to understand reality is through stories. It's not so much through data and statistics, though those are very helpful contextually, but as far as connecting hearts across difference, story is the way to do that, because that's how we understand, connect, and relate to each other.
Connecting hearts across difference. Okay. You use that word architecture, and so much of what I've seen you do is almost build a space for that question of asking people, what are their stories? So Hidden Voices is an arts collective, and your mission you guys have is that to challenge, strengthen, and connect our diverse communities through the transformative power of story. So what does that look like, and what are some of the populations that you've engaged?
Yeah, so we have worked with undocumented youth, with the unhoused, with military service members, with families escaping violence, with farm workers, with lots of different communities who have invited us to come in and work with them. So I think one of the things that's kind of important and different about our work is we don't go into a community with any kind of agenda. We just bring a process. And so when we go into that community, we have a series of what I think of as generative questions that we pose to we'll gather like a circle of stakeholders, the people that community identifies as those whose voices need to be heard. So we bring everybody together and we just work through these questions. And the first question is about outcomes. What changes would you like to see nationally? What changes would you like to see in your community? What changes would you like to see in yourself? By virtue of participation. So it kind of goes through there. And by the time we finish working through that, we have this gorgeous outline of where we're all trying to the change we're trying to create together, what we're going to create to try to accomplish that change, who needs to speak and who needs to listen. So it's just every time it's a complete adventure when a community invites us in and we show up. We have no idea what we'll walk out of it with, and neither do they.
Well, even when you talked with people who were on death row, it didn't lead to, which we'll talk about, it didn't just get to one thing. It led to a host of projects. What are some other projects or presentations or exhibits that have come out of some of the groups that you've talked with?
Oh my gosh. Well, we almost always do performance. So we take some of the stories that are shared, we craft them into a story cycle. And so those story cycles can be read in classrooms, just sitting in a circle, each person reading a story. They can be presented by actors in a more performative way. For conferences, we create traveling interactive exhibits. We do media. We've created walking tours. We've created different kinds of digital mapping projects. So it's basically, since we don't know when we go in a community what we're going to create, it just evolved very organically out of what the needs and capacities are.
How did you get to a process like this? Was it trial and error, or was it sitting with a group and saying, this seems like this will make the most sense? How did you end with something that solicits stories like these?
That's such a good idea. I mean, such a good question. I have no idea. Yeah, it was a process of just working with people long enough to where we sort of fine-tuned it. You know, we fine-tuned. We always just went in with questions, but then those questions became more like, these are the questions that have to be asked of people to enable them to speak authentically, you know, about, and also because it's a beautiful process, because, you know, a lot of times the people in the group haven't really thought about that. Like maybe they haven't thought about what kinds of changes I want to see in myself.
Right.
If I participate, or what kind of changes, you know, and so we are all in this real process of discovery together.
You engage people. It sounds like you're engaging people as humans, which is, I think I haven't labeled that in my mind just in all our conversations over the months, but you're engaging people as storied beings, as performative beings. And we could have a whole webinar just on this aspect of performativity, but I love that you take the reality of what they're saying in their experience, you filter it through a performance to call others into that reality, to consider their own reality. That is, it's an arc that seems like it's brought a lot of response from people. And it seems, of all the populations that I know that you've worked with, the one that was the most unexpected was those on death row. So how did you come to work with people who are on death row?
Yeah, well, we were in, I actually think one of the guys living there read an article about our work and tore it out and took it to the director of programming and said, can you get these people in here? So I got an email from the director saying, would you consider coming in and developing a project for these men? They have nothing. And so I said, give me 6 months to finish up. We were working on a project on the school to prison pipeline. So that was like a very natural kind of evolution to move into working around incarceration. So I said, give me 6 months and then we'll come in and we won't develop a project for the men, but we'll develop a project with them the way we always do in a community. And so I said, why don't you pick a certain number of men that you feel like will be really engaged and want to participate and see the potential of this kind of collaborative work. And because, you know, we have to really trust each other to do that work. And he said, okay. And then we went in and we worked over 2 sessions. We worked through our regular process. And in the end, we came out with this beautiful, like 4-page document about the outcomes we wanted to see, what we might create together, and who needed to listen and who needed to speak.
Why was it as an artist you were willing to go into that space? I mean, I know you were invited, but you could have declined that as an invitation. What was it about that space with those men at that time that drew you to decide we're gonna take our process and apply it here?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I think it was just that, like, we have had communities or groups who've asked us to work with them where we felt like they didn't really need us,
Mm,
that they actually had the capacity and the connections already. And so, and given that we can't do everything we're asked to do, we tend to focus on those for whom we feel like, oh, we can really be of service here. And so with people living living on death row, as far as
yeah.
having, I mean, they didn't even have telephones, right? So their access to the outside world was not existent other than through letters. So there was clearly a need, and so that's why the project's called Serving Life, Revisioning Justice, and we titled it a call and response, which is really something you referred to earlier, right? That there's this, the whole intention is responsiveness, that we create something that goes out into the world and invites people to come and participate.
Mhm.
And then that participation somehow is registered and then sent back to those who created the initial call. And with the men living on death row, I mean, you can't imagine a more intentionally hidden population.
Absolutely. I've said of your book to you and in other spaces that it requires a response from its reader. It's not one that you can set aside or that you can dismiss if someone's able to make it through, right? And you have the
Yeah.
book ended by two people who came in to help frame some things, and then you forefront everything in the middle. 90% of the book are the voices from these men. So I want to frame a little bit of what we're talking about for people who are watching and listening, of talking about mass incarceration and death penalty, and then get into some more of that initial meeting and what were some of the things that the men had as a goal with it. A lot of these are things that but I think gathering them here helps. Mass incarceration, if we're talking about that as a country, we as a nation have an incredibly high incarceration rate. We have 5% of the world's population, yet 25% of the world's prisoners. We have over half of the world's female prisoners are within the United States, and 2.3 million people are incarcerated. There's 2,300 jails and prisons. And so we have an obsession as a nation, it seems, with incarceration. And within that is this idea of punishment. And in no other way is that more explicitly expressed than executions, than capital punishment. But the hopeful thing in your book, I'm hoping will help highlight this movement, is the movement for repeal. If you go back into the 90s, over 80% of people in the United States supported the death penalty. And since then, that has drastically changed. 23 states have repealed the death penalty, and the District of Columbia, just last year, my state in Virginia was the first former Confederate state to repeal it, which was thrilling and exciting. So there's momentum. Public support for it has dropped. And your book touches on some of those classic critiques of it. It talks about how the death penalty is applied in a racially discriminatory manner, how the death penalty is expensive, how the death penalty is torture by almost any measure of any international group, not just the death penalty itself, but the way that it's done, the acts that are done leading up to it. And we've executed a lot of people in the United States. We've also exonerated a lot of people. Since 1973, we've exonerated 186 people who were wrongfully convicted. We've executed over 16,000. There's 2,500 people on death row right now. So I say all of that less to you, Lynden, and more to those that are listening, to capture this is something within our nation that reveals a lot of who we are. When I taught as a teacher, I talked a lot about how art shapes and shows us. It's something that actively changes us, and it reveals who we are. And a correction system within a country does that as well. It reveals priorities of that place, and it also shapes its people. So none of us is untouched by what happens within the criminal justice system. And so your book, I think, pushes readers to respond to that, to really confront the humanity of what's there. So can we go back to that room in those first couple meetings with those men? What was it that they had as a goal? What did they want to come out of this project? Because I remember we talked and you said unanimously they came around an idea.
Yeah, I mean, they had a number of goals, but their top one that they identified was, we want people to know we're not monsters. We want to disrupt the stereotype of who lives on death row. And I hope that the book does that in really powerful and profound and inescapable ways.
So in constructing the book, in the stories you chose, the order you put them in, and how you framed them with who wrote at the beginning, at the end, how was it that you wanted to show the humanity of those people on death row through how you just functionally assembled the book?
Yeah, that took a long time to figure out. And interestingly, so I had mentioned the story cycles that we do with each project. So an editor from Duke Press actually heard one of the story cycles and said, "Have you ever thought about publishing these?" And of course, what takes 45 minutes to perform or read, is very, very little, very small amount of text. But I thought, oh, I mean, I've got thousands of pages of stories from people. So I thought, yeah. And I assumed that the press would want sort of like a story and a scholarly reflection and a story and a scholarly reflection. So you hear about from the point of view of education or the point of view of mental health, so all of these different themes that are interwoven. And the editor said, no, I think we need to just bring forward those stories. Let's privilege the voices of those who are most impacted. And that blew my mind. So that led to this whole, like you're saying, most of the book, you just hear people's stories.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had thought about organizing the book thematically, but I thought we should, because you can almost read the book as if it's one person's journey
Mm-hmm.
to death row. I mean, obviously there are many different voices, and we tried to keep the authenticity of the different voices, but it's almost right like that. So it starts with stories from infancy, and then you follow these stories through preschool and elementary school, through high school, through basically ninth grade, when almost everybody drops out who's incarcerated, and then through arrest and through trial and through the sentencing. And then a goodly portion of the book is about life on death row. What's that like for people living there? And then it takes us up to facing execution. What happens when you get your execution date?
Mm-hmm. Somebody in the chat anticipated the next thing I was going to point out, which was your dedication page. So you have this book. This book is dedicated to you, the readers and change makers, by those living on death row. And then there's a quote from one of the individuals you interacted with. "We're all strong men here, but to not have your suffering recognized is the greatest indignity to the human spirit. Thank you for breathing life into our weary, wounded souls." How did that frame the book and its goal, that kind of dedication?
Well, I think it is a call to readers to engage to be willing to engage, to open your heart, because you are going to experience great suffering in these pages and great sorrows. You're also going to engage incredible kindness and compassion and humor and transformation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I really wanted to use that man's words to offer a call to readers to be willing, to be willing to be open and know that you can, know that you can do that. You can stand there and you can take in these stories and you can be changed. And to be willing to do that takes a certain kind of courage. So I wanted to call forth that courage kind of on the reader's part.
Mm-hmm. There were two other choices that stood out with the book. One is that there's 99 stories, and the other is that I don't remember anybody's name, and I know there weren't really any identifying features of how old somebody was exactly, or what race they were, of where they were in the country. So those seemed like intentional decisions. So why those two decisions?
Yeah, they were very intentional. Well, the reason they're anonymous, I mean, there are some obvious reasons, which is just that it presents potential danger to the men in the situation where they are. If people if authority figures find out they're participating in something like this, that can create attitudes and difficulties. Their families, whether or not their families, and also everything Hidden Voices does, the stories are always anonymous. So we do try to offer that level of protection for people and their families. We take out all place names, all individual names. And And it's an artistic choice, because when you speak these words or you read these words, they're all in first person. So when I say these words, it's as if I'm speaking about myself, and it makes a kind of connection. So you don't have to overcome the barrier of feeling like, oh, I'm a 19-year-old white female, and now I'm reading the words of a 65-year-old African-American man in New York, like if that's all gone, if the labels are gone, we can just get so close to the experience. So that was the point of that. And then, oh, you asked about the number of stories. Well, initially I thought, oh, I'll find 100 stories. Like, that's a nice number. I'll do 100 stories. And then I thought, no, I'm just going to do 99, because to me that felt unfinished. And for me, the final story is the story of these men leaving, the story of these men walking out those doors and returning to their communities and their families. So I left that story to be written.
When I talk about stories, I talk about, of course, that stories have a beginning, middle, and an end. We talk about stories have an arc, often of moments of creation, fall, or crisis, and restoration to them. And I used to tell my students that every story has those elements or leaves you wanting them. And if one of them's not there, and in your case, it's this idea of reconciliation, restoration, some kind of conclusion, it's intentionally not there because it's not resolved for these men, for the system, and you're left sitting with that. So what is it that you want, as people engage this book, a reader to feel or to do? And I know that's a risky question for an artist, right? You absolutely want people to leave that open to people, but what are things that you envisioned could happen as a feeling response to this and as an action response to this, or things that you've seen people over the less than a year or so that the book has been out?
Yeah. There's so many just incredibly beautiful and moving stories. And one that I remember was at the end of hearing these stories, a woman who was sitting there she was just weeping. And she said, I just feel ashamed. I feel so ashamed. I drive by a prison every day, she said, and I have never once wondered about who was inside. And this is making me wonder what else I've never thought to wonder about. And in some ways, that's kind of an encapsulation of both your questions in a way. What do we want people to feel? Well, we want them to feel whatever they feel, so long as they're feeling. And I believe that change doesn't happen until our hearts are connected and our hearts change. Real change can't happen without some kind of connection, some kind of human, compassionate connection. And so there's not really an opportunity for effective change until, why would we want to change anything, right? How would we feel motivated? Where would that come from? So I think you're just right. The question about feeling and then doing, because we have to, that space of heart connection is just us being together with no need to do, right? It's just being with another human being, their story, their experience. And then out of that, doing can arise, and a kind of doing that doesn't do harm. So I think that's why it's so important, because we can make all kinds of decisions about what needs to be done and what kind of policies should be changed. But if we haven't connected on a heart-to-heart, compassionate level, then a lot of harm can come from those decisions.
And any other kind of connection and motivation isn't lasting. It's not one that can sustain without that shift. And I think of in the justice world, there's a lot of talk of narrative shifting, and there's a narrative shift often for a reader or someone engaging people on death row from thinking of that person's a monster to now thinking that person's a human. But it's more than just a narrative shift. It's a worldview shift. It's a paradigm shift. It's a cultural shift. And to have those that are on death row labeled as monsters or thugs or criminals or convicts is easy. And it also is something that helps us. I think maybe part of where people, if they read the book and they feel shame, is we realize whether actively or passively, we've done that. We've dehumanized by categorizing somebody as something other than fully human. And to do that does something to that person, and you're confronted with that in the book, but it also implicates you, whether that's knowingly done or not, whether we've driven past that prison or not. And that's a really weighty feeling. And so I like that in your book, it leaves you to both sit with that for a bit. It ends with, you had Timothy B. Tyson come in, the scholar, to write almost Truman Capote-esque capturing of the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. And that's increasingly poignant now, right, as the verdicts are coming out from the trials that have gone on with those killers. But you also have a way forward. You give your readers some options of things to look at and some things to consider. And we'll talk about some of those, but I just really wanted to highlight that journey, which is massive for someone, of going from monster to human, because nothing can really happen for reform or change or transformation until you see someone as your human equal.
Yeah, it's so often people say, I really, that the stories really humanize the men. And I think that's really true. But actually, my motivation was very much to humanize us because of exactly what you just said. It's so tempting to other people, to say that has nothing to do with me. They have nothing to do with me. And the only way we can really do that is to make them somehow less than human. And like you said, that makes us less than human. And so that journey of moving through this recognition of, we're talking about babies or young children or teenagers. And you could read these stories in a sense and come out of it and be sort of like, oh my God, what these men went through. No wonder they're monsters, right? Because they had to endure all of this. But actually, I think by the time you finish with all the stories of great compassion and humor and tenderness that they also shared, you realize something very different. It's more like, how can they not be? I mean, it's such transformation. It's amazing. How can they not be monsters?
Right.
After going through all of that. Yeah.
And if someone's human, then you're obligated to treat that person as such. And as a nation, in so many spaces, we don't do that with people who are in prison. Certainly not with those who are in death row, but anybody who is in prison. They're an inconvenience, a dismissible piece of society. I wrote out a couple of the quotes that touch on some of this, that capture some of the stories from the book. One of them was, "I was a convict long before I ever did time." And I think that captures that category of being a convict is often something that happens before the person develops the crime, and that there are, of course, stories and pathways to that. But often that person just being an other, which is what being a convict is, that journey begins far, far sooner.
Yeah.
So you wanted to focus on different themes in the book, I know, and there were so many ways you could have constructed the book and so many themes to touch on. And I love that it's chronological, because you get these overlapping and interwoven themes all throughout it. One of them, though, and you've mentioned it a little already, is the theme of violence, that these individuals who have gone out and committed a crime and harmed or traumatized others themselves have been harmed and traumatized, which obviously doesn't excuse it at all, but it puts it in a different frame. It allows us to explain how somebody got there. And so there were three quotes that really stuck out, or a few that stuck out to me with that. One person said, "Violence was just a response to the environment in order to survive." Really highlighting the environment that person came from. And again, not excusing it, but just stating a fact of this violent environment is going to provoke violent people to come out of that and to commit these things. Or another who said, "Yeah, our childhood was basically boot camp for prison," which I think was one of the section titles within the book. And then the last one, "I became a beast lest I become a meal," right? None of those ring to me as someone trying to make an excuse for what they've done. all of these are capturing, this is what I've come from. In a sense, it's almost like, of course I'm here. What else could have happened from this? But that theme of violence is threaded all throughout.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was really interesting for us, especially for the men that we worked with in person, because we were bringing a different kind of perspective, a different kind of context that they had had not necessarily ever thought of, so and I may share this in the introduction, but one of the guys was talking about how when he was, he said, why, we made the choice to sell drugs. And of course, in their neighborhoods, the drug dealers were the people who were really looked up to because they had gear and they were able to help their families with their rent and they were able to provide food. So those were the really esteemed role models. So, when the guy was like, oh, I made a choice when I decided to sell drugs, at 13. And from our perspective, because I'm like, I don't think that if you're in that kind of environment at 13 and you need money to pay y'all's rent, that really selling drugs is so much of a choice. Because I had kids who had been that age, and if they had wanted to sell drugs, it would have been impossible. So it spoke so much more to where they grew up. One time we had a conversation about how old people were the first time they saw a murder, the first time they saw someone get killed. And I think the oldest person was 13 or 14. So yeah, we are talking about growing up in a completely different kind of environment than I grew up in. And as you said, when violence is how you survive, then that's your go-to response, which I think makes perfect sense to anybody who's, considering.
Right. And the more you read these stories from these men, the more you see that their violence is often an act of desperation rather than something that's as calculated and cold and cruel as we would paint the monsters to do that. If you're listening, I'm doing air quotes with the monsters, but there's another quote that's in there, or I'd say this too. I think of Common Justice, the organization that's based out of New York, and they talk about in Danielle Surratt's book, Until We Reckon, which you mentioned at the end of your book, which is an incredible book that captures so much of what we're talking about. But she cites research, or the research that shows violence is most often a response to shame. And that individuals who feel shame, that violence is a response to divert attention or to cover something up, which if we polled people, I doubt very few people would say, oh, violence is a response to shame. But we think of those environments that you're describing that a lot of these people come from, or an environment that happens with trauma, or just in response to trauma. All of that is really laden with shame. And if we start thinking about someone feeling shame rather than someone just being a violent person, that's what a human would do or feel. A human would feel shame. And again, it does not excuse that act, but it gives this context around it that reminds us of, this is a person just like me, also in need of healing.
Yeah, exactly. And that shame just continues throughout incarceration. I mean, that is the point of incarceration, is to demean, belittle, and shame people. And so it doesn't get better once somebody goes to prison. It gets worse. People don't get better from being there.
Right. And for those that leave, it continues on. You have that label. It affects your job. It affects where you live. It affects whether or not you're able to vote, how you engage society. Another man in the book said, you can't be rehabilitated if you ain't never been habilitated in the first place. And there's echoes in that of, in the evangelical world, there's the debate of whether or not it's appropriate to talk about racial reconciliation or conciliation, because people would argue, when have the races ever been actually brought together? And so it's not a reconciling, it's not going back to something that we had because we never had it. And it sounds like there's an echo of that here as well, of I can't be rehabilitated, which one is absolutely not the goal of what prison is even equipped to be able to do. But the person was making the point, I've never even been there.
Yeah. I mean, everybody on death row, there's nobody rich on death row. There's not even anybody middle class, right? Everybody on death row comes from poverty, comes from hunger, comes from, yes, exactly. So we haven't offered any kind of wholesome or healthy environment for these children to grow up in. And and that's very clearly the point that he was making and they were making. It's not like you're trying to return somebody to a state of wholeness or wholesomeness. We never had that.
So we're less than a month away from Easter, and we're in the season of Lent, where Christians are mourning and fasting and building up to the joy of celebrating Christ's resurrection for Easter. And this is fitting because the way that you end your book, it was timely to go through and look through this again in leading up this conversation, because my favorite, again, I would do air quotes, but the story that most moved me was the 98th one that's set in Holy Week. Right? That's a reference to leading up until Easter. And it is about a priest who comes in and washes the feet of those that are there on death row. And it's something that would happen every year. And the person talks about some people wouldn't come because it made them feel a lot. It made them feel shame for someone to come and stoop before them and wash their feet, as Jesus did on the night before he was arrested. So we're approaching Holy Week, and he ends it by saying, "It reminds me that even though I may think I'm at the bottom of society's barrel, Christ would serve the lowest of the low without hesitation. Seen through the eyes of Christ, there is no better or worse." And then the very next story is the 99th one, right? The one that we're sitting with. The 100th story isn't there. It hasn't been written. And it's called Dawn. And as we move towards, for the Christian world, celebrating this resurrection time, also think about Maya Angelou. You quote her and her idea of bringing the dawn. So how was that an important theme to end on, that idea of dawn, right off of that second to last story of Holy Week, Maya Angelou talking about bringing the dawn? How are all those connected with this book then provoking a response?
Yeah, that quote was so beautiful. One of the guys talked about how, I think it was maybe Mother Earth News or something that he liked to read, and it had this picture of these hippos, and it had this quote about bringing the dawn, and how he hoped that somehow we would all bring the dawn, that we would be bringing forward new possibility and new hope. And that's why I wanted to end that extraordinary story, which is about a man whom I love very much, talked about the moment he got his execution date and how everything became crystal clear for him, and how he just was in love with every moment of life and every connection with every other human being, and how he saw how precious each moment was and how precious connection was. And he talked about being right here, right now, that's love, and that's a whole lifetime. And so that I really wanted to end with that vision of this moment, with the hope of dawn and this moment. Yeah.
So how would you call readers to bring the dawn? What are some ways of responding to this? You list some things people could read at the end, but what are some ways that people could engage with this as they feel these weighty things? What comes after that?
Well, let me tell you a little story first, because I think that it's a beautiful story, and it just happened a couple of days ago. So we were doing a presentation of we're working on a musical theater piece, sharing stories from family members of death row. So we were sharing songs and then these stories, I think maybe 20 of the stories from the book. And at the end, we invited audience members, to share anything they might want to share. And this woman, this Muslim woman, stood up and she was just breaking down. And it turned out that just a few months ago, her nephew had been murdered and had been shot repeatedly. And I think his parents had found him in the trunk of a car. So she offers that at that moment after listening to these stories. And there was a man on the panel with me who's Buddhist, and he lost his son to violence. So he spoke to her about how there's no way to take that pain away. You know, there's not anything any of us can offer that will actually heal that pain. And he talked with her about how he had the restorative work he had done that had helped. And then in the audience, sitting directly across from the Muslim aunt, was a mother who turned to her and said, "My son is on death row because he murdered somebody. And I have not hugged my son in 20 years." And she said, "There's nothing I can offer you, but I want you to know how very, very sorry I am for your loss." And so you had this Muslim woman, this Buddhist man, this mother of a man living on death row, coming together in that moment to feel each other's suffering, to connect across real difference, you know, and to offer each other a kind of healing. You know, the aunt of the young man who was murdered said, "This is helping," you know. And I think about what's required as far as action to repair the harm that's done in our society. And I think that's what's required. You know, I think that that's a kind of doing, the courage of that aunt to stand up and say publicly, "This is what happened to me," the courage of that mother to respond and say, "My son caused that kind of pain to someone too." And for us to understand the bigger context. So you know, there are a list of things, of actions people can take. You know, so many of the requests we get from people living inside is for pen pals, some kind of connection to the outside. You know, I think there are a lot of practical things, and I talk about some, I think, in the book, practical things people can do, offering talents to, you know, a minimum security facility. If you're a cook, they need to learn how to, all kinds of things if you're a teacher. But again, there's also this kind of connection of sharing stories, of book clubs that read and talk about our country and what we've created and how we uncreated and move forward. And I think that's just really powerful.
But my hope in a lot of this work that you and I are in is to help provoke a posture towards humans, towards stories, towards truth, almost a submission towards those things and those people. And then all those other things follow, right? Like we have the lists and the petitions and the campaigns and all of the ways to get involved. And I can send you all of those things, people. But before moving into those things in those spaces is an approach to this. It's true. And you name those two pieces of truth telling and seeing and engaging someone's humanity. Because without those things, it's false and it's not sustaining any response someone might have.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it.
So I want to give people who are watching a chance to respond. So if anybody has any questions that you want to ask Lynden and talk about, and that you'd like to talk about, put those in the Q&A. There's one in there now. We'll start with that one, but we'll take the next 10 or 15 minutes or so and go through any questions that any of you all might have. So you can click on the Q&A at the bottom and type that in. If you can't find it, feel free to put those in the chat too. I can see either of those. So Lynden, Susan's asked, how are your projects funded?
That's always a puzzle. I mean, grants, donations, goodwill, a lot of love, but you know, primarily grants and donations. You know, we work on a shoestring, and that's not a surprise to anybody.
I think you'd said to me once early on when we met that you took two things and put them together that are very inconvenient to be funded. And it was, what was it, art and social justice? Was it these?
Yeah. We created a beautiful niche 20 years ago where two areas that had no funding, we put them together. So, yeah. But, you know, we're starting to see, actually, this is starting to become a thing. Arts and social justice is a kind of movement and a collective movement. And that's a beautiful thing to see. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe there's hope.
Right, increasingly. Yeah. My friend Zaid asked if there are any dramatic presentation approach programs like this in New England. He's in the New York, New Jersey metro area.
I don't know is a real answer because the kind of work we do is pretty radical in terms of we're not a theater group, we're not an, you know what I mean, we don't only do visual art, we what we create comes out of that engagement with the community. And so we're a really flexible arts collective. So sometimes we're working, sometimes we're working with performers, sometimes we're working with audio designers, or we're working with people who do civil rights mapping. I mean, it just, so it's great because we have a whole lot of folks who love this kind of work and are willing to engage with us in order to create what a community can envision.
Well, then I might follow up Zaid's question with this. What pieces of things that you all have done, other than the book, obviously, are accessible to people living anywhere?
Yeah, so the story cycles are completely accessible. And we have story cycles around every project we've done, I think. And so that's a curated collection of stories that, like I said, can be can be sent to a classroom or a faith community or any sort of organization who wants to organize a reading, a very simple reading and then discussion about those stories. And just like the stories for Right Here, Right Now, they're curated around certain themes that are really important in addressing the issues. So the stories in Right Here, Right Now, those themes that you mentioned, there's violence and mental illness and failed school policies and racism and police misconduct. So there are lots of themes that run throughout the stories, but we don't highlight the themes, we're highlighting the actual stories. And the themes are, you can't miss them.
Absolutely. How can people follow you and your work and keep up with what you're doing and access the book?
Yeah, so the book's available at your through Duke Press, through Amazon, or through your local bookseller. So it's very, very easy to find. And as far as following us, if anybody wanted to email, they can just email info@hiddenvoices.org to ask a question or get materials or whatever. And then you can follow us on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, or sign up on our website.
So I'll put in the chat the link that takes people directly to your website and to the book, so people can access that down there. And then I'll put also, let me pull up for the Evangelical Network another link that'll connect people to some things for us, as well as your book, which is listed on there as well. So, and then I want to end by reading this piece that was something that you wrote in the introduction, right? So there was the foreword that Henderson Hill did, your introduction, Timothy B. Tyson wrote at the end. And again, the book is the stories from these men. But you write in your introduction this, you said, what we hide in the dark obscurity of prisons and jails are real people, shredded by mental illness, violence, abuse, and poverty. It's my favorite quote from what you wrote, because it captures, I think, those two themes that you talked about of we have to truth tell. And that truth telling includes talking about that these individuals, that all of us are shredded by trauma, and that you see a disproportionate amount of that with those that are on death row, mental illness, violence, abuse, and poverty. And then the hope is that will lead someone to see people's humanity. What we try to hide in prisons are actually people with problems similar to those that we have, in the sense that they've experienced something traumatic, but at egregious degrees. And that's part of what's helped lead these people here. And so I love that you quote Maya Angelou and that you talk about bringing the dawn, because it's about the light. And in this dark obscurity in prisons, the hope is to bring light to this place. And there are many, many ways to do that. You're doing that in your work. The Evangelical Network at EJUSA seeks to do that as well. And there are so many ways to change and come under a different posture. There's so many ways to respond and engage in these campaigns as we work towards helping shape people's hearts and also toward the practical goal of repealing the death penalty. So, Lynden, any final words before we close out?
Well, first of all, Sam, thank you. I always love talking with you, and I have been a great admirer of Equal Justice USA for years. So it's a real honor to be here and to bring these stories forward. And I think I am absolutely convinced that this is totally possible in the foreseeable future to end the death penalty. And, you know, I'd like to see the end of life in prison without parole. We do not need that. There are people inside who need to be cared for and need to be cared for in secured settings, probably for the rest of their lives. They don't deserve to be kept in these torturous circumstances. And I really, just like you, I mean, it's the tide is shifting, and anything we can do to push forward the understanding that there is a dawn, that there's a different way to do it. We don't have to invent the wheel. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are many countries doing a much better job with rehabilitation, with restoration. And also I want to acknowledge that the system doesn't serve victims at all. And so we are talking about a system that harms a whole lot of people. And I know that there are other ways. So let's stop doing that. Let's stop doing that. And let's look how to repair the harm.
Absolutely. Great. Well, we've recorded this. Someone's asking about the recording. If you've registered for the event, we'll send out the link to this. We'll put it up on YouTube in the next day or so, and you all will get a link to this so you can access that, so you can share that with anybody. Lynden's website for Hidden Voices is there within the chat. You also can just Google that. Please reach out, see her work, and that the organization is doing. Lynden, thank you, my friend, for the work that you are doing. Thank you for your mutual obsession with stories and your willingness to see the humanity in other people wherever that may take you. You are on a sacred mission with what you are doing. So thank you, and thank you for sharing that with us today.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, Sam. It was a real honor to be here.
All right. Thanks, Lynden. All right. Thank you all for joining us. Bye-bye.